The Surrounded by D'Arcy McNickle. Chapter 14. They were burying Father Gillipo in the crowded church. Mass was being celebrated. Max knew little of what was said and done. Dull of feeling and confused of thought, he stared blankly. Truly the world had melted like a snowflake in his hand. His friend was dead, and his son was in jail. The priest was honored and beloved. The tall candles around his coffin burned steadily in the chill air. The choir filled the church with its melancholy music, while the Indians in the rear of the church kept up an undertone of wailing which occasionally rose in shrill crescendo, drowning out the formal funeral music. Their primitive expression was more heart-rending. It chilled one's blood. Max was trying to form a picture in his mind of the dead priest, and found that he could not do it, in spite of the fact that he had been at the bedside only a few days before. It was this failure which had thrown him into such confusion. He gazed at the fresco of the Last Judgment above the altar, but it was meaningless blur. In his last days Grillo was thin, his clothes hung loosely, and his hair was white and soft. Max could see the hair, but the eyes, the mouth, the expression was all that was blank. He felt crushed by this failure of his memory. Vaguely his mind drifted backward through the years. There things were a little sure, he could call up pictures always of the same man, a man unhurried, soft in his speech, wearing a black cassock shiny and rather green with age. These pictures were also of a man who chopped trees and carried stones, a man who worked like a peasant to make a garden in the wilderness. And he heard him protest, "My part in that was small. I but witnessed the building of the temple of God. Only one thing they didn't understand, and that was sin. We taught them, and that was the beginning of their earthly happiness." He knew with what devotion the priest had given himself to the career of a missionary. Back in Poitiers he had already finished the regular philosophical course when the idea came to him. He was then 18. He would lose no chance of making himself useful. He studied medicine, then engineering. Before he was ready he had become a trained botanist. He had worked in a machine shop, and had even placed himself under an artist to learn draftsmanship and wood carving. None of these accomplishments went unused. In the early years of settlement he was often the only man with medical knowledge within a month's journey, and he had doctored Indians and whites, infidels and faithfuls alike. He had dammed streams and built grist and sawmills, in which he even planned and set up the machinery, and everywhere were bridges and buildings on which his hands had labored. His notebooks were full of geographical observation. As for his art training, that too had been put to use on occasion. When no one else felt equal to the task, he had painted murals and carved wooden crucifixes for the wilderness chapels which he had planted everywhere. His craftsmanship was not the least of his talents. He had the capacity of several men for work, and he had kept up that pace for most of his life. Men who followed him could only marvel. His affection for all Indians was deep, and in practical matters he understood them. He saw how admirably adjusted they were to the conditions under which they lived, and he learned their ways of wilderness travel and existence. He was at once superior to them and able to place himself on their level when the occasion required it. He despised and inveighed against those who despoiled the Indians. If the reservation system must remain, he wanted the agents removed or strictly supervised, and he wanted to see tribal laws and customs restored and respected. Above all, he wanted to see white men kept off the reservation and only allowed to trade at supervised posts. He had great faith in the army men who had served in the frontier posts through the years of the Indian wars. With few exceptions, the commanding officers he had known had been on the side of the Indians, even when they took the field against them. One officer had once told him that in almost 40 years of campaigning he had never known the Indians to be in the wrong in any controversy with the government or the white settlers. He trusted the army, and would have been willing to see permanent posts established in the vicinity of every reservation, not to interfere with Indian affairs, but to protect the Indians against their own agents and the white settlers. The greatest sorrow was the decay of the missions, when Congress, because of the pressure of certain religious spokesmen, refused to allow funds already owing certain tribes to be used at the request of the tribes for certain support of mission schools. The burden had become too great. In the early years, priests and nuns had got their funds by going out on annual begging tours of mining camps and settlements. Late Latterly, that and other sources of revenue failed, and when Congress refused support to mission schools languished. He never quite resigned himself to the sight of unused buildings falling into despair. That was the missionary priest. As his own book revealed him, a man of prodigious labors, a priest of gifted insight and broad sympathy, and a pathfinder. Max Leone could think of him in all these ways, and now that the priest lay dead, he could ask himself what it signified. Blasphemous thought, but Max could not rid his mind of it. What good had been accomplished? What evil? Throughout the 60-mile valley, banks, stores, and farms flourished. The railroad pushed through in time, and every day its trains rushed along, carrying the produce of many laborers. Children studied in schools, old men passed their last days, met death, and were laid to rest in the same peace and security as attended any old world community. Grappello had shown the way over the mountains, and the world had followed at his heels. Life and industry filled the valley from one end to the other. But was that enough? The question came unbidden, and Max worried with it against his will. Practical man though he was, he asked himself whether people and farms and railroads answered that question. As for the Indians who had been taught to understand sin, certainly they offered no satisfaction. Instead, one had to ask of them, were they saved or were they destroyed? Bringing the outside world to them was not exactly like bringing heaven to them. These questions appalled him, and that they should fill his head now with the priest lying in his coffin was near sacrilegious, or at least it was disloyalty to a good man. He shook them off by telling himself that Greg Pillow needed no justification. In performing the labor to which he had been called, he had fulfilled himself. That was all a man ever did. The singing ceased. A melancholy more pronounced than ever entered the church as the people sat back and waited for the visiting bishop to give the signal for the start of the procession. Was the good priest of whom everyone cherished some venerable memory, was he really to leave his mortal friends? There was a hush of wonder. Some doubtless expected the coffin lid to be cast aside and a white figure to arise. To them it was more of a wonder that he should remain mortal. When Max took his place with the pallbearers he began to flush and tremble. When he took up the coffin it was as if he alone bore the weight. Outside the snow blew in flurries, and the wind drove frost into the flesh. The coffin was slipped into the rear of the horse-drawn coach. Someone came out with Max's fur coat. He would have forgotten it entirely. The procession went forward to the cemetery. Everyone for miles had driven in for the funeral, fighting through heavy drifts and braving the stinging frost. It was not every day they came to bury a Greg Pillow in this wilderness. The procession was so long that when its head reached the cemetery gate the last marchers had not left the church, and that was half a mile away. Village dogs came out to bark at the strange sight, but the people moved so deliberately and with such indifference to the howling that the dogs grew silent and sat down to watch. Finally, they went away one by one to find the warm corners they had left, all except one demented creature, who pointed his nose to the sky and howled. The marchers shivered with superstitious fear and crossed themselves, wondering who would be the next to die. Max was still trying to visualize the priest's face, and his continuing failure deepened the despair he felt. He had won respect for himself at last, and for something more than his money. As he bore the coffin of his only friend, he walked with a judge before, a state senator behind. Today he had risen among the accepted citizens. The snow stopped just as the open grave was reached, pieces of canvas covering the opening and the pile of earth that had been thrown out. The snow was soiled where gravel had spilled over it. A funeral address was pronounced, of which Max caught only these words: "We had a saint with us, but he is gone from our house." Max had been so uncovered for so long that numbness had been creeping upon his brain, but those words stirred him up. What made them stand out was the fact that they recalled how the priest had just looked just before he died. He remembered at last. His hair had a silken gloss, and the skin had taken on a transparency which gave the illusion of a light burning within. The more than recalling the priest, the words came as an answer to the rude question which had troubled his mind. If Grappello were a saint, then it was God's good that had been served, and you could not go behind that. At the last, as the last prayers were said, whimpering and low cries broke out, and long wailing sounds came from the group of Indians. Everyone seemed overwhelmed by the spectacle of the grave. The nuns in their black gowns, standing with bowed heads, seemed waiting to be struck down. Eastward the mountains appeared out of the departing storm clouds, and as sunlight struck them they shone with blinding splendor. They rose to astonishing heights. In a moment the coffin had sunk from sight. Someone threw on the first dirt, a solid mass which sounded like a stone hitting the box. Those near enough to hear shivered, thinking of the coldness of the ground. Those were the only impressions Max had of the funeral. Much more had been said and done there, but it had been lost on him. He had said his farewell, and now he turned to walk away.